More than 1,000 Americans had died on a beach 2 miles long. As the casualty lists came home, mothers across this country sat down and wrote to the most powerful man in the Pacific. They wrote, "You killed my son," and he read everyone, because he knew in part that they were right. This is the story of what he did next. A story almost no history book tells. December 14th, 1943, a conference room at Pearl Harbor. 4 men sit around a single table, among the finest military minds the United States has ever produced. At the head of the table, Admiral Chester Nimitz. To his right, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. Across from him, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. And beside Turner, the Marine, General Holland Smith. On the wall behind them hangs a map of the Marshall Islands. Nimitz has brought them here with a plan. And before he commits a single ship, before he sends a single man, he wants to hear what they think of it. He looks at each of them in turn, and he asks. Spruance answers first. Too dangerous. Turner does not soften it. Reckless, outright reckless. Holland Smith only gestures toward the map. Take the outer islands first. 3 men, 3 answers. The same answer. And to understand what Chester Nimitz does in the silence that follows, you have to understand where he had been 18 days before. Because 18 days before this meeting he had stood on the beach where they had died, he had walked the length of it. He had breathed the air above it, and some of what killed them he had ordered. It begins on a strip of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. An island called Bitio in the Tarawa Atoll. 2 miles long, less than half a mile wide, but Bitio had an airfield. And that airfield was a door to the Marshalls, to the Marianas, and eventually to Tokyo itself. Every road to the home islands of Japan started here. On 2 miles of sand most Americans could not find on a map. On the morning of November 20th, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division went in to take it. And almost everything that could go wrong did. The tide that morning was the wrong tide. A neap tide, the weakest pull of the month. It held the water down over the coral reef, far below what the planners had counted on. The Higgins boats, flat-bottomed, the workhorses of every American landing in this war, came in fast. And then they stopped. They ground to a halt on the coral. 800 yards from shore, the Marines did the only thing left to do. They climbed over the sides into chest-deep water, and they began to walk 800 yards, under fire the entire way. The men went down in the water, singly, in groups, in rows, and the great bombardment that was supposed to clear the way, the shells meant to break the island open before a single Marine touched the sand, it had lasted 3 hours. 3 hours, against bunkers of reinforced concrete and coconut logs the Japanese had spent 2 years building. When the smoke lifted, the defenders were still there. Most of them. When it was over, more than 1,000 Americans were dead. On November 26th, 3 days after the fighting ended, Admiral Nimitz flew in. Vice Admiral Spruance came with him. The airstrip was still cratered. The plane landed anyway. Nimitz stepped out onto a beach that no longer looked like land. The dead were still there. The men with shovels had been working for days, on an island only 2 miles long. They had not been able to bury them all. Nimitz had spent 30 years in the Navy. He had seen the aftermath of battle before. He had never seen this. And here is the part that does not make it into the speeches. The bombardment that failed at Betio, the 3 hours that were not enough, that limit had come from the top. Nimitz had set it himself. He had a reason, a real one. Far to the west, at a base called Truk, sat the Japanese combined fleet. If it sortied while his ships lay anchored off Tarawa in shallow water, the disaster would be many times worse than a hard landing. So he had told Spruance in plain words, get in and get out. Speed over patience, surprise over preparation, that meant a short bombardment. It meant no time to seize the small island nearby, Bairiki, and turn it into an artillery base before the assault. Every one of those choices was defensible. Every one was made by a careful man weighing real and terrible risks. And every one of them, in the end, was paid for in the water off the beach. Nimitz flew home to Pearl Harbor. And the letters were waiting. They came from every state in the country, from small towns in Ohio, from farms in Georgia, from neighborhoods in Boston and Pittsburgh and San Diego, where boys had grown up playing baseball, then sailed west and not come home. Hundreds of them, arriving every single day. His flag lieutenant, a young officer named Hal Lamar, tried to keep them off the desk. Lamar understood that the admiral was already carrying the weight of the entire Pacific War. He did not need this on top of it. Nimitz disagreed. He read everyone, and the words did not spare him. "You killed my son. What was it for?" And Nimitz sat down, and he answered them, not with a form letter, not with a stamp and a secretary. By his own hand, one grieving mother at a time. To his wife he wrote 4 words he would never have said to anyone in uniform. "I am just as distressed as can be." He walked the hospital wards. He sat beside men who had lost arms, lost legs, lost things no letter home could name. He stood at the bedside of a dying boy and told him that his country was proud of him, and then he went back to his desk. And he made his decisions, because this is the thing Chester Nimitz understood, standing in the wreckage of his own orders. Tarawa had to be taken. That part was right. You needed the airfield to reach the Marshalls. You needed the Marshalls to reach the Marianas. You needed the Marianas to put bombers over Tokyo and bring the war to an end. Every link in that chain was real. Betio was not a mistake. How they took it, that was the mistake, and he knew it before anyone had to tell him. So the question in front of him was not whether to keep fighting. It was something sharper than that, and colder. How do you take the next island and bring more of them home? That was the weight he carried into the conference room at Pearl Harbor on the 14th of December. That was the question hidden inside the plan on the wall, and his 3 finest commanders had just looked at it and told him with one voice, no. No, that was the answer, from all 3 of them. The finest fleet commander in the Pacific, the most experienced amphibious commander the United States Navy had. The hardest fighting Marine general in the country, 3 men who had earned every inch of their place at that table, and every one of them had just looked at the plan on the wall and told Chester Nimitz it was a mistake. Think about that for a moment. Most men sitting in that chair, hearing 3 voices like those, would have folded. Would have told themselves that 3 experts cannot all be wrong, would have taken the safe road and slept easier for it. To understand why Nimitz did not fold, why he could not fold, you have to understand the map on that wall. And you have to understand the 2 roads drawn across it. The Marshall Islands, more than 30 atolls scattered across a stretch of the Pacific the size of a nation. The next step west, the next door on the long road to Tokyo, but you could not take all of it at once. No fleet on Earth could. You had to choose where to put your men ashore, and there were 2 ways to do it. The first way was the careful way, the sensible way, the way the United States had done it before, and done it well. You start at the edge. You take the outer islands first, Wotje, Malawalap, the ones nearest Pearl Harbor. You land. You build your airfields. You bring your land-based bombers forward, one hard-won runway at a time, and then, only then, with your bases secured behind you and the enemy ground down, you reach in for the heart of the chain. Step by step, island by island, nothing ever left at your back. That was the plan Spruance wanted, the plan Turner wanted, the plan Holland Smith wanted. And after Tarawa, after more than 1,000 young Americans had died taking 2 miles of coral, who in his right mind would stand up and argue for anything bolder than careful? The careful way was the safe way. Every man in that room knew it in his bones, and that exactly was the problem. For weeks before the meeting, American reconnaissance planes had been crossing the Marshalls, high passes at altitude, low passes down on the deck, cameras running, anti-aircraft fire reaching up for them. Every atoll in the chain, photographed and photographed again, and brought home. When the film came back and the prints were developed, the analyst pinned the maps to the wall at Pearl Harbor. And slowly a picture took shape out of all that grey film. The outer islands, the very islands the careful plan would take first, were bristling. Fortified, reinforced, airfields packed onto them, coastal guns dug into the coral, thousands of enemy troops in their positions, waiting. Waiting. That was the word that should have stopped every man in that room cold. The enemy had fortified the outer ring because the enemy expected the Americans to come at the outer ring. They had studied the same map, they had reached the same sensible conclusion. They had told themselves the United States would do what any careful military would do, work from the outside in, and they had built their defenses to meet exactly that. which meant the careful plan was not just cautious, it was the one plan in the world the enemy was already braced for. Nimitz had a planner, a lean, quiet, razor-minded officer named Forrest Sherman. And Sherman looked at those photographs, and then he looked past the bristling ring to the atoll sitting in the very center of the web. A place called Kwajalein, the enemy's own headquarters in the Marshalls, the island they had held since before the war began. And Sherman saw the thing the others would not let themselves see. You could skip the ring, you could bypass the outer islands altogether. Leave their airfields to the carrier planes to be smashed flat from the air and starved on the vine, and drive straight in, past all of it, for the center, for Kwajalein, and strike the enemy in the one place he had not braced himself to be hit. It was not safe. Sherman never once said it was safe. He said a single word: feasible. His chief of staff, a sharp officer named Charles McMorris, agreed. Feasible, not certain, not without terrible risk, but possible, for Chester Nimitz, after the letters, after Betio, that one word was enough to call the meeting. December 14th, the four of them around the table, the map on the wall between them, and the weight of more than 1,000 dead men still hanging in the room, whether anyone said so or not. Nimitz laid it all out, the photographs, the fortified ring, the case for bypassing every bit of it and going for the throat. And then he did something that tells you almost everything about the kind of commander he was. He did not order. He did not pull rank and shut the conversation down before it started. He went around the table, and he asked each man one at a time to tell him the truth. "Raymond, what do you think?" Spruance did not soften it, and his objection carried a weight that the others did not, because 18 days earlier Raymond Spruance had stood on Betio beside Nimitz. He had walked that ruined beach, he had breathed that air, he knew, in the way a man only knows by seeing it with his own eyes, what a fortified atoll did to the boys who had to take it. And his judgment was hard and clear. Kwajalein sat deep inside enemy waters, ringed on every side by those airfields on the outer islands. Supply lines stretched and exposed, and if the landing stalled, if the enemy reinforced faster than expected, if the thing went wrong the way Tarawa had gone wrong, there was no fallback position. No second beach. Just American boys, cut off, alone, in the dead center of the enemy's strength. This was not a timid man flinching from a fight. This was a man who had seen the bill up close, 18 days ago, and was not willing to gamble with it again. Turner went next, and Turner went further. You have to understand the man saying these words. Richmond Kelly Turner was the hardest, most abrasive flag officer in the Navy. They called him Terrible Turner, and he had earned it. He drove himself past exhaustion, and everyone around him with him. He had a temper like a struck match, and he was at the same time the finest amphibious commander the country had produced, the man who had written the book on how to put an army across a beach and keep it alive. When Kelly Turner told you a plan was reckless, he was not flinching either. He had spent his whole career studying exactly this kind of operation. And he said the plan was dangerous. He said it was reckless. He said the outer islands had to come first. That was the proper sequence. The Navy did it that way for a reason, and the reason was written in blood every time someone forgot it. And then Holland Smith, the Marine, the one who had argued before Tarawa that the whole campaign was a mistake, the one nobody ever accused of being soft, found himself, for once in his life, standing on the same side as the admirals. Take Watje, take Malalap, build your air cover first, then, and only then, go for Kwajalein, the three of them finished. And the room went silent. Nothing they had said was new to him. He had been living inside these objections for 2 solid weeks. Turning them over in the dark, testing them against the photographs, against the intelligence, against every scrap of paper that had crossed his desk since the morning he walked off that cratered airstrip on Betio with the smell of it still in his clothes. He looked around the table, at the 3 finest men he had, at the unanimous, expert, deeply considered judgment of every commander he would have to trust to carry the thing out. And then he said it, quietly, almost gently. "Well, gentlemen, our next target will be Kwajalein." Most of the men gathered their papers and left. Spruance and Turner stayed. Whatever formality had governed the meeting was gone now. These were not subordinates protecting their careers. These were professionals who believed, with everything they had in them, that the man they served was about to make a catastrophic mistake with the lives of American boys, and they were not going to let it pass without saying so to his face. Dangerous, reckless, the same two words, spoken straight at him now in a near-empty room, and here is what you have to know about Chester Nimitz to feel the weight of what he said back. He was not a shouter. He did not win arguments with his rank or his temper. For 30 years, the men who worked closest to him had reached for the same words to describe him. Calm, approachable, genuinely willing to be told by anyone that he was wrong. Spruance himself, who knew him as well as any living man, would say years later that of all the things he admired in Chester Nimitz, the one that stood above the rest was his fearlessness. But there is a difference between being open to being wrong and letting another man's fear make your decision for you. Nimitz let them finish every last word, and then he said it. If you don't want to do it, I'll find someone who will. That was the end of it. Spruance and Turner walked out. The decision was made. Now, the history books will tell you that Nimitz had good intelligence, that the photograph supported the plan, that the logic was sound and the bet was a reasonable one. All of that is true. But here is the part the books do not put down quite so plainly. He did not know, not for certain. Not the way you know a thing you can prove. He had evidence. He had analysis. He had 30 years of hard-earned instinct for how fleets fight and how men hold and how men break. But between all of that and certainty, there was a gap. There is always a gap. Nimitz knew it was there. He could feel it, and he stepped across it anyway. Because he had already read the alternative, he had read it in the stack of letters on his desk. The careful way meant more weeks. More weeks of bombing outer islands that did not need to be taken. More weeks for the enemy to pour concrete and dig deeper. More weeks of young men crossing an ocean toward a target that grew harder to take with every sunrise. He had answered too many grieving mothers already. He had signed his own name under too many words that began with the death of somebody's boy, and he was not going to write more of those answers out of an excess of caution. But here is the truth that the bold decision rested on, the truth without which it was only a faster way to fill those letters. A bold plan kills men quicker, unless you first fix what went wrong the last time. And so, while Nimitz fought for his decision inside that conference room, another fight was already underway. A quieter one, out on the grey water of the Pacific. On the long voyage home from Tarawa, Rear Admiral Kelly Turner, the same hard, abrasive, unbending man who would stand in that room and call the Kwajalein plan reckless, sat down at a table somewhere in the middle of the ocean, and he began to write. He gave it a plain, flat title, Recommendations for Changes and Improvements in Tactics, Techniques and Material. It was not a short document. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's own planning officer, a captain named James Steele, put together a companion piece, and Steele gave his a title that did not look away from what it was. 100 mistakes made on Tarawa, 100. That document, and the ones like it, became the operating manual for everything that came after. And every line written into it had been paid for, in a sense, by a man who lay dead in the surf off Betio. The tide that no one had read right, written down. The 3 hours of bombardment that had not been nearly enough, written down. The Higgins boats that had ground to a halt 800 yards from a beach, written down. The radios that had drowned in the salt water, written down. The shortage of those tracked amphibious vehicles, the LVTs, the only machines that could actually crawl across the reef, written down. The failure to send a single set of eyes onto that reef in the final hours before the boats went in, to check the water with their own hands, written down. Every man who had died wading toward Betio with his rifle held above his head had, without knowing it, added a line to that list. Every body in the surf had become a sentence. Every grieving mother's letter on Nimitz's desk had become, somewhere in those pages, a fix. It is a hard thing to say out loud, but it is the truth of how armies learn. The dead at Tarawa taught the living how to take Kwajalein. And by the time the fleet began to assemble for the marshals, 5 specific things had changed. Not one of them was genius. Every one of them was simply what should have been done the first time. First, the bombardment. At Betio, the great guns had fired for 3 hours. from a distance considered safe, with shells designed to explode the moment they touched anything. Against open trenches, those shells had been devastating. Against bunkers of reinforced concrete, built by men who had spent 2 years preparing for exactly this kind of pounding, they had been noise. For Kwajalein, the bombardment would run for 3 days, not 3 hours, 3 days, and the shells would be different. Armor-piercing rounds, built not to bloom on the surface, but to drive through it, to punch into the concrete and detonate inside the thing that was supposed to protect the men in it. Second, the direction of the attack. At Betio, the Marines had come in from the ocean side, the obvious side. The side the enemy had spent 2 years fortifying for exactly that approach. For Kwajalein, every landing would come from the other side. The lagoon side. Through the inner waters of the atoll, where the reefs were thinner and the fortifications lighter, and the enemy had simply refused to believe that American amphibious vehicles could ever cross the outer reef and come at him from the back door. After Tarawa, he believed, but you cannot pour new concrete in 10 weeks. The bunkers he had built faced the wrong way now, and there was nothing he could do about it. Third, the small islands. This is the one that mattered most. And this is the one that should make every man listening sit a little straighter in his chair. Before the main assault on Kwajalein itself, before the Marines and the soldiers went ashore on the big islands, American troops would land first on the smaller islets ringing the atoll. Tiny pieces of coral with strange, almost gentle names: Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson, some of them barely wider than a city block. Some barely wide enough to stand on without getting your boots wet, but wide enough to set up artillery. By the night before the main assault, army howitzers on Carlson Island would already have their guns laid on Kwajalein, ranges marked, gun crews waiting. Marine artillery on captured islets to the north would have done the same for Roy Namur. When the big day came, every Japanese position on the main islands would be hit not just from the sea but from solid land, from American guns set on coral that had been enemy territory the day before. Now, listen close, because at Tarawa this exact idea had been put forward. A small island nearby called Bairiki, a staff officer had asked, "Let us take it first. Put artillery on it, pound Betio from a piece of ground we already own before we send the Marines into the water." And the request had been denied from the top, denied by the man who needed to keep his fleet from sitting in shallow water any longer than absolutely necessary. The man who needed surprise more than he needed prepared fire. The man who would, weeks later, walk that same Betio beach and breathe what his own decision had helped to leave behind. The thing that had been refused at Bairiki became the cornerstone at Carlson, the same admiral, the same idea. The same map of the same ocean. The only thing that had changed was what he had walked through in his uniform. Fourth, the men in the water before the boats. After Tarawa, Kelly Turner, the same Turner who had just called the Kwajalein plan reckless, ordered the formation of 9 new teams. The underwater demolition teams, the first of their kind in American history, men who would swim in ahead of the landing. Sometimes in the dark, sometimes in broad daylight, under fire, to map the reef, to mark the channels, to find the obstacles and destroy them before the boats came through. At Kwajalein, only the first 2 of those teams would see action. Their work would be small, some of it would go wrong. The drone boats they tried to use would run amok in the surf, but they were there, they went in. And they began something that, in the years to come, would grow into the United States Navy SEALs. If you are watching this, and your grandson or your nephew, or the boy down the road serves as a SEAL today, that line begins here. On a reef that killed too many Marines, watched by an admiral who refused to ever let it happen the same way twice. Fifth, the vehicles themselves, the LVTs, the tracked amphibious tractors that could crawl across coral where no boat could float. There would be more of them, better armoured, better armed, enough of them this time to carry the first waves across the reef no matter what the tide was doing on the morning of the landing. 5 changes, none of them brilliant, all of them obvious in hindsight, every one of them paid for with the lives of the boys who had waded into the water at Tarawa with their weapons held above their heads. And here, if you let yourself sit with it for a moment, is the strange and bitter shape of the thing. The man who had stood in that conference room and called the plan reckless, Kelly Turner, was, at the very same time, the man who had sat down on a ship and written out the cure for the wound. The man whose hands shook with anger across that table was the man whose hands had filled the pages that would save the next 1,000 boys. He fought the plan with everything he had, and he was the one preparing the ground for it to succeed. In the weeks that followed, the orders went out. The fleet would sail. The Marines and the Army's 7th Infantry Division would board their ships. The bombardment groups would form up, and every man in the chain, Spruance, who had said dangerous, Turner, who had said reckless, Holland Smith, who had said the outer islands first, would do his job, every last one of them, because that is what professionals do. They argue in the room, and then they execute. Out on the grey water of the Pacific, 10 weeks after more than 1,000 Americans had died in the surf off Betio, a vast force was beginning to move. Roughly 50,000 men, nearly 300 warships, 2 new teams of swimmers no one had ever heard of, a fleet of newly armoured tracked vehicles that the men who had needed them at Tarawa would never see. And at the head of it all, an admiral who had been told by his 3 best commanders that he was about to throw his men into the deepest trap the enemy had set, and who had, in the quiet of his own conscience, decided that he was not going to write any more of those letters than he had to. 1,000 miles to the west, on an atoll the Americans had never set foot on, the enemy was waiting. But he was not waiting in the place the Americans were coming. He was waiting in the place Spruance and Turner and Holland Smith had said they would come. He was waiting on the outer ring, and he had no idea, none, that the fleet steaming toward him in the last days of January 1944 had already decided to go straight past him. Straight to the centre, straight to Kwajalein before dawn, January 31st, 1944, rubber boats in the dark, quiet paddles in quiet water. Soldiers of the United States Army's 7th Infantry Division, sliding over the sides of their transport and out into the inner lagoon of an enemy atoll, most of them had never heard of 3 months ago. They were not going for the big island yet, they were going for the small ones, Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson. 4 pieces of coral barely wider than a man's living room, scattered along the southern edge of Kwajalein Atoll, most of them held by clerks and signalmen and aviation ground crew. Men who had not expected in this lifetime to be in a ground fight. By the time the sun came up, the islands were American. By nightfall, the howitzers were ashore. The 145th Field Artillery Battalion of the Utah National Guard worked through the dark on Carlson Island. Gun crews moving by flashlight, aiming stakes driven into the coral, rangers called, registered, marked. Across the water, the great Japanese base on Kwajalein Island was sitting inside their fire fan. 45 miles to the north, Marines of the 25th Regiment had done the same. 5 more small islands, 5 more artillery platforms. Rai Namur, with its airfield, with its bunkers, with its 3,500 defenders, was now ringed on 3 sides by guns set in solid ground. This is the thing that should stop your breath for a moment. The exact idea that had been refused before Tarawa, the small island, the artillery, the prepared fire from land you already owned, was now being carried out on the eve of Kwajalein. The same admiral, the same ocean, but now, finally, with the lesson of Betio paid for and learned. At first light on February 1st, the bombardment that had begun the day before resumed, and this time it did not stop. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the newly landed artillery on Carlson hurling its shells across the lagoon, bombers from Mark Mitcher's carriers working in waves overhead. The numbers are difficult to take in. 7,000 naval shells fell on Kwajalein Island that day. The artillery on Carlson added 28,000 more. 36,000 rounds on a single piece of land less than 2.5 miles long. It is, to this day, the most concentrated bombardment of any battle in the Pacific War. For 2 long years, Japanese engineers had built their defenses to face the sea, the deep water, the obvious approach. The way an American attack was supposed to come. For 36,000 rounds, all of it came in from the other side. In the north, at Rai Namur, something happened that the planners had not quite dared to count on. A rear admiral named Richard Lansing Connolly commanded the attack force off the Northern Islands. He was 51 years old. He was not a flashy man. He was not a man whose name made headlines. He had the mind of an engineer in the uniform of an admiral, and he held a belief about naval gunfire that he had been working toward for most of his life. You cannot break a fortified position from a comfortable distance. A shell fired from miles out arrives at an angle. It glances off the roof, it cracks the wall and does not get through. Some percentage of the time, it does real damage. The rest of the time, the men inside the bunker simply wait and listen and live. If you want to break the bunker, really break it, you have to bring the gun close enough to fire flat. Close enough that the shell hits the front of the wall like a fist hitting a face, close enough to drive through. At 12 minutes past noon off the Northern Islands, Rear Admiral Connolly sent a signal to the battleship USS Maryland. The signal was not in the careful technical language the Navy used for most of its orders. It read like a man speaking plainly in a room full of speeches. Move in really close, that was the phrase. Move in really close, and the Maryland moved, closer than any battleship had any business being. Inside the effective range of the Japanese coastal guns. Close enough that the crew on her deck could watch individual coconut palms come apart through their gun sights, struck by their own 16-inch shells at nearly point-blank range. The bunkers that had survived 2 days of conventional bombardment began to come apart now, not rattled, hit. The Japanese defenders inside them stopped being annoyed. They started being killed. That afternoon, Richard Connolly earned a nickname that would follow him to the end of his days. Close in Connolly, he had put his own ship in danger to save his Marines. It is not in principle a complicated calculation. Every officer understands the trade-off in the abstract. What takes something more than understanding is the willingness to actually do it. To order your own crew into the range of enemy guns because you believe, down to your bones, that the men on the beach are worth more than the risk to your hull. Connolly believed it, and just before noon the first wave of Marines hit the beach at Roy. It was an unrecognizable place. 3 days of bombardment, Connolly's ships firing from inside 1,500 yards. The men who had crouched in those bunkers for 2 solid years were not, anymore, the same men they had been. They came out armed, some of them still fought, but they came out dazed, blinking into smoke and light, like men who had been buried alive and only just dug their way out. The Marines moved across the airfield. At 6 o'clock that evening, 7 hours after the first wave crossed the beach, the 23rd Marines declared the island of Roy secure. 3,500 Japanese defenders, 1 island, 7 hours. At Tarawa, Betio had taken 76, but the story of February 1st on Roy is not only the story of Admiral. It is also the story of one man who was not supposed to be there, Private First Class Richard Beatty Anderson. 22 years old, born the 26th of June 1921 in Tacoma, Washington. He had grown up in a small community called Agnew out on the Olympic Peninsula. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, and the nearest city was an hour away by car. He graduated from Sequim High School on the 6th of July 1942. 7 months after Pearl Harbor, he walked into a recruiting office in Oakland, California, and he enlisted in the Marine Corps. He was 21 years old. On his arm he had tattooed 4 words, Death Before Dishonor. He joined Company E of the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines of the 4th Marine Division. He shipped out for the Central Pacific in January of 1944. On the morning of February 1st, on the airfield of Roy Island, Private First Class Anderson was a mortarman. By his job, by his training, by every rule of how a Marine company is supposed to operate in combat, he should have been in the rear with his crew, with his weapon, providing indirect fire support for the riflemen ahead of him. For reasons no one who was there was ever able to fully explain, that is not where he was. He was at the front, moving across the cratered airfield with the rifle companies, carrying a box of grenades, hunting snipers in the wreckage. The bombardment had left the runway pockmarked. Craters 15 feet deep in some places, deep enough that a man could drop into one and disappear from view. They offered cover. They drew men toward them. In the middle of the afternoon, Anderson saw one ahead of him and slid down inside. 3 other Marines were already there. Anderson reached into the box, took out a grenade, pulled the pin, rose to throw. And the grenade slipped. A fraction of a second. The kind of thing that happens to hands that are tired or sweating or shaking in the middle of a battle on a burning airfield in the heat of a Pacific Island afternoon. The grenade fell to the bottom of the crater. 4 men inside. No time to climb out, no time to find it and throw it clear. No time for anything except the one decision that Richard Anderson made in whatever piece of a second he still had. He threw himself on it. He took the full force of the explosion. They pulled him out, carried him back. Evacuated him to the USS Callaway, anchored out in the lagoon. He died that same day. The 3 Marines in the crater with him walked off Roy Island alive. Richard Anderson never met Chester Nimitz. He did not know about the meeting in the conference room 2 months before. He did not know about the photographs, or the argument, or the letters on a desk in Pearl Harbor. He did not know about Close-in Connolly, or the Maryland, or the bunkers that had been broken before he set foot on that airfield. He did not know any of it. He was a boy from a small town on the Olympic Peninsula who was in the wrong place at the right moment, and who, when the moment came, did not hesitate. 6 months later, on the 17th of August 1944, a ceremony was held at the naval station at Pier 91 in Seattle. His stepmother, Mrs. Oscar Anderson, stood at the front. She accepted the Medal of Honor on behalf of the boy she had helped raise. The following summer, on the 7th of July 1945, she was back at that same waterfront, this time to christen a brand new destroyer of the United States Navy. She broke the bottle across the bow of the USS Richard B. Anderson, DD-786. The ship would serve for 30 years. Korea, Vietnam, the long, cold watches of the Cold War, 3 decades of the United States Navy carrying the name of a mortarman from Agnew, Washington, into waters the boy himself never lived to see. 3 men, Chester Nimitz, who read those letters because he could not look away from what his own decisions had cost. Richard Connolly, who moved his ship inside 1,500 yards because he could not accept a kind of victory that wasted boys he could have saved. Richard Anderson, who threw himself on that grenade because he could not let 3 men die if there was anything left in him to stop it. 3 different men, 3 different ranks, 3 different versions of the same refusal, to let the people beside them pay a price they could absorb themselves. None of them knew each other. All of them were there, on the same day, on the same atoll, on the same 1st of February, 1944. In the south, the battle for Kwajalein Island itself was harder. The 7th Infantry Division fought for 4 days, building by building. Bunker by bunker, the Japanese garrison did not surrender. They were not going to surrender. They fought until they were dead. The island was declared secure on February 4th. Their commander, Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama, a quiet man who had come from a farm family in the south of Japan, who had been ordered to defend an atoll he had only reached the previous November, with troops who were mostly raw reservists and Korean laborers brought there against their will, on islands too narrow to fortify the way Tarawa had been fortified, was killed in the fighting. He had done what he could with what he had. It had not been enough, and far behind him, at his headquarters at Truk, Vice Admiral Masashi Kobayashi, the man who held overall command of the marshals, sat with the news of what had just happened, and slowly understood the size of his miscalculation. He had moved his best troops to the outer islands, to Wachia, to Maloelap, exactly where Spruance and Turner and Holland Smith had said the Americans would come. He had been ready for an attack that never arrived. By doing the bold thing, by overruling his 3 best commanders, Chester Nimitz had, without knowing it, struck the enemy at the one point on the entire map where the enemy was not ready to be struck. When the final accounting was done across the whole atoll, Kwajalein in the south, Rai Namur in the north, the 30 smaller islets in between, the numbers told a story almost no one in America heard. More than 8,000 Japanese defenders dead, 372 Americans killed. Across an operation that involved roughly 50,000 assault troops and nearly 300 warships against a target nearly twice the size of Tarawa, with nearly twice the enemy garrison, 372. Less than 1/3 of the price that had been paid for 2 miles of coral at Betio, Nimitz had expected the operation to take until the middle of February. Kwajalein Island fell on the 4th, Rai Namur had fallen on the 2nd. He was weeks ahead of his own schedule. On February 5th he flew in. He walked the ground as he had walked Betio, but this ground was different. The men with shovels were not racing against the dead. The fighting was over almost before it had begun. In the days that followed, interrogations of prisoners revealed something he had not dared to count on. The next great atoll in the chain, Eniwetok, 400 miles to the northwest, was lighter than expected. The window to take it before the enemy could reinforce was open right now. Nimitz did not call another meeting. He called Raymond Spruance, the same Spruance who 8 weeks before had stood in a conference room and told him, to his face, that Kwajalein was dangerous and reckless. He told Spruance to take Eniwetok immediately, with the reserves that had not been needed at Kwajalein. Spruance did not argue. He did not say, "You were right and I was wrong." He did not have to. He executed the order. Eniwetok fell by February 21st. An assault that had been planned for May finished in February. When the war ended, when the last signatures went down on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, the name Kwajalein did not appear in many of the headlines. Tarawa was famous, Iwo Jima was famous, Peleliu, Guadalcanal, Okinawa, battles that had cost the country thousands of its sons and were carved into the national memory because of it. Kwajalein was not, and in a strange way that absence tells you everything. History is drawn to the places where the most was lost, where the photographs were the hardest to look at, where the casualty lists ran the longest, where the families back home had the most grief to hold. Kwajalein was won too cleanly to make that kind of history. It is the battle that history forgot because it went right. But the men who did not come home from it were not an abstraction. They were somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. They were boys from Tacoma and Georgia and Ohio who had grown up in the years between the wars in a country still figuring out what it was and what it owed the world. They had answered a question that none of them had wanted to be asked, and on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most Americans cannot, even now, find on a map, they had done what was asked of them. There is one more thing worth saying. If your father shipped out from San Diego or San Francisco in the early years after Pearl Harbor, if your uncle was on one of those transports, or one of those escort carriers, or one of those grey ships standing off an atoll in the dark, there is a chance he was there. At Kwajalein, or on the water around it, or overhead, he may never have told you about it. The men of that generation did not, as a rule, tell. Not because there was nothing to say, because some things happened at a level below language, below the kind of words that work at a dinner table on a Sunday afternoon with grandchildren in the room. They carried it quietly, not as a burden, exactly, just as weight, the ordinary weight of having been somewhere and seen something that changed the way the world looked afterward. If you have one of those stories, if you heard something in a car on a long drive, or at the end of a man's life when he finally started to talk, write it down in the comments. Even a fragment, even just a name, those men deserve to be remembered by the full weight of what they did. Not only by the battles that made the front pages, but by the ones that did not, by Kwajalein, by the names no headline ever carried, but their families never lost.